Museum began with a vision from the late Senator John Glenn, who understood the value of telling and sharing the story of our veterans. From the initial view, the architecture impresses upon visitors the importance of what lies within. Seeming to rise organically from the earth, the building itself is a symbol of our nation's veterans and their resilient spirit and unending commitment to making this country stronger. Once inside the museum, visitors embark on a narrative journey, following exhibitions that focus on the servicemen and women and their families. Individual stories and shared experiences are illustrated through personal artifacts, quotes, letters, photographs, and powerful films of veterans telling their unique story in their own words. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum. It's more than a museum. It's the new home of the brave. Plan your visit today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining our latest Veteran Voices program at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. My name is Colonel Retired Bill Butler, Chief of Staff. On behalf of our President and CEO, Lieutenant General Retired Mike Farrader, welcome as we commemorate the 41st anniversary of Operation Eagle Claw, the daring raid by U.S. Special Operations Forces to rescue dozens of American hostages in Tehran, Iran. Just to provide a little bit of context and a strategic overview, tomorrow marks the 41st anniversary of the raid into Iran to rescue 53 Americans captured by Iranian militants the previous fall. In 1975, the Vietnam War ended, but we were still in the throes of the Cold War with the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries. Because of the fallout from Vietnam, Americans and American policymakers had a distaste for overseas entanglement. At the time, Iran, led by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was aligned with the United States. Islamic fundamentalists, urged on by exiled Ayatollah Khomeini, grew dissatisfied with the Shah, his government, and reforms. Because of increasingly violent demonstrations in late 1978 and early 1979, the U.S. Air Force began evacuating almost 10,000 Americans, hundreds of tons of cargo, and 169 pets out of Iran. The ensuing power struggle between various factions resulted in the permanent exile of the Shah and his family to Egypt. Millions demonstrated in Tehran and other cities, and over 500 died in the violence. The American embassy was stormed by armed militants and hostages were taken, but control of the embassy was returned to the United States after Khomeini security forces intervened, and the U.S. Air Force continued evacuating Americans. On November 4th, 1979, 3,000 militant students stormed the U.S. Embassy, taking 63 Americans hostage, plus 3 additional Americans at the Iranian Foreign Ministry. The latest assault on the embassy was sparked because President Carter allowed the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. 10 hostages, all women or African Americans, were released within a week, but the remaining 53 waited for negotiations and diplomacy to secure their release, all while being threatened with execution should the U.S. intervene militarily. Once it became apparent that diplomacy was not going to free the hostages, President Carter approved the military rescue operation on April 16, 1980, Operation Eagle Claw. American special operators from all branches of service attempted the unthinkable, a raid halfway around the world to fly into Iran, breach the embassy compound, secure the hostages, and exfiltrate out of Iranian territory. Today, we have a great program to talk with some inspiring warriors about the operation. Facilitating the discussion is our President and CEO, Lieutenant General Mike Farrader, Major General David L. Grange, Lieutenant Colonel Bucky Burruss, and Chief Warrant Officer 4, Paul Zeisman. All were members of the task force that attempted the raid. They will tell their story. Sir, over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and welcome, gentlemen, and welcome everybody to our Veteran Voices. I got to tell you, this is awe-inspiring to me here at the National Veterans Memorial Museum, because these three gentlemen were the soldiers who said, I want to be with the very best of the very best units, and I want to be given the very toughest of the toughest missions, and I want to compete to get onto those teams, and I'll never let anyone down. And I lived in awe and was mentored by each of these men. And as a Ranger of the 80s, 90s, and a little bit 2000s, we always lived hoping that we would never let down what you showed us was the right way. And we hope that the way we lived is the way the Ranger Force. So there's a direct connection between you and the Rangers that are in contact even today. So we'll start with some introductions. And first of all, with General Grange, just tell us about yourself and your background and your experience during your career.
Well, I spent about half of my 30 years as an infantryman and the other half in special operations units. Had the privilege to start in Vietnam. I actually was over in Vietnam with my father in the 101st Airborne, and then went to the 81st Airborne Ranger Group as an advisor on the second tour. That tied me in a little bit to some of the Bucky Burruss and some of the other people involved, Charlie Beckworth, because they commanded Project Delta at the time, and that name carried on in some other future operations and units. I think that my last job was as the division commander of the Big Red One. I commanded the Task Force Green in Iraq that had members of all the units involved today that we're going to talk about. Commanded the 75th Ranger Regiment, battalion in Korea, squadron in the unit of Delta, and then 4 times as a company commander and platoon leader quite often. So I was lucky to have a lot of ground time and with some terrific NCOs and officers that I was able to serve with. The highlight actually was when I was the commander of Hard Rock Charlie, which was a supporting company, supporting element of Delta for this operation. They were, of course, the spearhead. And that's where I met Paul Zeisman and Bucky Burruss. Paul being the best communications soldier I've ever met in my life. And Bucky Burruss was actually not only at the time the deputy commander, but he was a mentor to myself as a young captain with the group and my soldiers, because he understood that even though you're an elite unit, you got to take care of the rest of the task force. And he was a mentor in that capability for me. So that's my experience. And I've been out for 20 years running medical companies and other security work around the world.
Hey, thanks, sir. Great lead in for this. And Bucky, tell us about your background and your role in Operation Eagle Claw, please.
Well, I'm a Virginia boy and from a long line of military folks. And so I enlisted in the Army in 1965, went to officer candidate school, infantry, was allowed to go directly into special forces, spent a couple of tours at Bragg and a couple of tours in Vietnam. Went to Germany with the 509th Airborne Mechanized Infantry. Somewhere there's a major wearing a Legion of Merit for that silly idea, and then went back into Special Forces. Worked in the Special Forces school for Charlie Beckworth. He allowed me to go over to do the British Special Air Service selection course, which I've struggled through. So when he started the Delta Force, I was one of the first guys who was able to go there. Spent my last 9 years on active duty in Delta. Retired as a deputy commander. And during Operation Eagle Claw, excuse me, I was the deputy ground commander for under Colonel Beckworth. Since then, I've been checking out all the breweries in Tidewater, Virginia.
Okay, that's a good thing to do as well. And Paul, tell us about your background, please, and the distinction that the communications meant for this operation.
Well, enlisted into the Air Force in 1960 and spent a little bit of time there, probably around 10, 11 years. And during the Vietnam era, they were openings for the warrant officer, so I applied for that and was accepted. Spent some time in Korea, and then fortunately I went back to 7th Special Forces Group in Fort Bragg, and I met Bucky, and this is how I got attached to Delta when he got me through Jack Cheatham, was get me an interview with Colonel Beckwith. And of course, seeing old Charlie, he asked me what my claim to fame was, and I told him, well, I'm a communicator, and so I was welcome on board, and I think I spent probably 28 years in Delta, and it was probably the best years of my life, where I met, General Grange, Bucky, Beckwith, all the mentors that I have. And one of the biggest mentors was Dick Meadows, who was part of this operation, who always said to get to the 80% solution. And I think that's what we did in this operation. And I want to thank, all the folks that were attached to the Signal Squadron during my era that made this operation go as well as it did. So it was the good people that I was attached to that really made things happen.
Very excellent. So as we look at that strategic overview that our Colonel Bill Butler gave us, is there anything that comes to mind that you'd like to add to give context to how this operation came about? And then I'm going to ask you each for what your specific role was. But anything that you would add that's kind of like the phone rings and someone says, come in, we got a mission. And when you heard that, then what happened? General Grange.
Well, we had, if I may.
No, Bucky should go because they were notified first. Go
Okay,
ahead.
Bucky, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, we had, actually, it was the night that we finished our certification as a mission-ready special operations unit, that the hostages were taken in Tehran. In fact, we were celebrating with a little wild turkey, and our CIA advisor came in and said, hey, guess what? The embassy in Tehran has been taken over by a bunch of students, or words to that effect. So shortly after that, I found myself on the way to DC with a very small planning group, begin planning to conduct an operation, if necessary, to rescue the hostages. From there, it developed into, from a very crude and simple plan into a much more complex plan that evolved over the next several months. Meanwhile, Paul was, he is probably the world's best communicator. Paul and his guys were developing satellite radios and developing open code so that they could speak to the advanced parties who went in, Dick Meadows and a guy named Fred. And Hard Rock Charlie, under Dave Grange, began practicing airfield assaults, something which has become the forte of the Rangers ever since. Pick it up there, Dave.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, if I may, so I was a company commander of Hard Rock Charlie, 1st Ranger Battalion, 75th Infantry, and we were doing some very unusual training, very, very good training. It's some of the best training that we ever did, especially on urban areas, taking down ships, taking down train stations, ambushing trains, you name it. We pretty well had an open slate for training. That's all we did was train. And when this happened, and Bucky may have to correct me, but when Colonel Beckwith asked for a security force, and the 1st Ranger Battalion was notified, and they selected Hard Rock Charlie. It was a weekend, Thursday. I happened to be in Fort Benning, Georgia, at the CG's residence for Thanksgiving dinner, which happened to be my father's house at the time. And got notified while we were having Thanksgiving, and someone had sent a small plane fly me back to Savannah, Hunter Army Airfield, and was given the mission. you have to understand the attitude of young officers at the time, because very few had had the opportunity to go to Vietnam. So there hadn't really been any conflict, except for some covert stuff, no real combat of any sort since Vietnam. And you trained and trained, or you did support work. So when you got a mission like this, you were extremely elated, of course. And it was a lot of operational security. And so people, once you were notified of the mission, and you start thinking about what you got to put together, you're told this, that, these numbers. Of course, they change constantly during the plan. But we went through that process, and then it was just the entire time was nothing but training and putting things together. And when we get to the next segment, I think I'll go into more detail on that, because it's really important. I think on small unit commanders getting things together and expectations on a mission like this that had been done before, a little different set than Sante and some of the other missions, but you really felt like you were in that group now, and it was quite a privilege and an honor and an experience. But I'll end there and wait for the next segment for more.
Okay, great. Paul, bring us in on the communications and things that you were doing at that moment.
Oh, sure. I'd like to just take you back a little bit of what we had in 1979. We're operating with 60 word a minute teletype. No capability to pass any imagery. If we wanted imagery, we had to send somebody up to Washington, to NSA or the agency, to courier it back in vehicle. So we had no capability at all. Our hardest part was, how are we going to communicate with all the moving parts within this, the boats, the ships, the aircraft. We had HF radios that really was the Army's long haul systems. And I looked at that and I said, with one-time pads and CW, this isn't going to make it. So we had to really look hard to figure out, how are we going to execute this through an execution checklist and pass these code words back with each event to the JTF commander. Well, it happened in 1979. We went into isolation at the farm, and before I left, I borrowed a radio from Motorola. It was called a PT-25. And me and Steve Mosian had it in isolation up there at the farm. And, Steve was a smart guy. And he said, this thing got an uplink and a downlink, and I think we could make this thing work on the satellite. So me and Steve's out there playing with this thing, and I'll be darned if it didn't work. It was a 2-watt radio, and it worked over the satellite, and we were just elated. So we took it from there and planned a mission. And in the meantime, Cincinnati Electronics came out with 4 prototype radios called the PSE-1 at that time. So the Army was able to get those as well. So we had some redundancy in that. And I can cover a little later on how we supported each of that during the events that Bucky and Dave covered there. But we had the solution. Now we had to put it together.
At a certain point, the thing that I marvel at is, how is it that the most disciplined, and often even called rigidly disciplined, organizations are the most innovative? So I want to get to that when the time is right. But if it wasn't for that culture of finding a way, then the Ranger Force, the other special operating forces, never would have changed the Army the way that you have. So it fascinates me that, whether it's breaching, or whether it's vehicle takedown, or whether it's airfield seizure, somehow these highly disciplined organizations, standards-based, allow their young enlisted and their young officers to be innovative. Let's move towards the raid itself, Bucky, and tell us what was the plan, actions at the objective, and lay that out for us, if you would, for the ground assault.
Well, initially, I think it'd be wise to point out the fact that there were a number of restrictions placed on us that made it very difficult to begin with. The president only wanted initially for the operation to be launched from U.S. territory and recovered at U.S. territory. And that in 1979, early 1980 was virtually impossible. The emergency assault plan we first came up with, very crude, but it was something that if we had to execute some operation in the event that the Iranians started killing a hostage a day or a hostage an hour and throwing them over the wall, what would we do? And the only thing we could come up with, particularly given the restrictions we had, was to, there was a highway that ran from Tehran that ran east into Afghanistan, where the Russians were still occupying Afghanistan. And there was a lot of smuggler traffic along there with basically 18 wheelers. So the initial crazy idea we had was if we had to go in right away and try to keep them from killing off the hostages, that we would parachute in along that highway, hijack a couple of these 18 wheelers, load the troops up on the back, make our way into Tehran, get to the embassy, take it over, and then turn around and say, okay, Mr. President, what next? Or we'd fight our way out to Van, Turkey was the nearest so-called friendly territory that we could get to. Well, obviously that was something we didn't want to do, and might not even have been executed had they started killing hostages. Hard to say. Over the next months, we were able to build up a number of assets. There were no CIA assets in Tehran because the embassy had been taken over, along with the people who ran the station. So there was no way that we could use. There were very few people in country that we could rely on to help us out. So we looked all across DOD for Iranians and Farsi-speaking persons, one of whom turned out to be this RF-4 camera mechanic, an airman second class, named Fred. I won't divulge his last name here, although it's probably pretty well known now. But Fred impressed us greatly as a guy who was calm and capable, intelligent, and innovative, which were the same traits, by the way, that the other guy who went into Tehran for us, Dick Meadows, possessed. So they went in to see what they could do for as far as close reconnaissance goes, and as far as collecting more assets. And over the time, as intel developed and as assets appeared, hello, pup, the plan evolved into this. We would make our way to the vicinity of Tehran. I'll get to the helicopter portion later, but we would make our way to the vicinity of Tehran, where we would be met by Fred and Dick, who had contracted some trucks, some covered trucks, a number of them, and a warehouse on the edge of Tehran. We would board these trucks, go into the warehouse during night one, and then night two, the next day, we would go in, attack the compound from several sides at once, rescue the hostages, move them to a stadium which was directly across the street, and that would be the point at which we would account for and lift the hostages out of Tehran. The problem all along, of course, and as Colonel Beckwith said from day one, we're ready to do this. Delta's ready to do this. All we need is somebody who can get us in and get us out. And that remained the problem, and ended up being the fly in the ointment, so to speak. We looked at a number of ways to go in. Eventually, it was settled on that we would use RH-53 helicopters off the USS Nimitz. The reason for this is that the RH-53, which is actually a Navy minesweeper helicopter, was able to fold its tail and and fit on the elevator of an aircraft carrier so that they could go below deck and would not be visible to the Russians who were shadowing all U.S. forces in the area constantly. That way they would be able to pull up these 8 RH-53 helicopters and launch from the Nimitz at night and meet us at a point in the desert that was designated Desert 1. There, the troops would show up, fuel would show up to refuel the helicopters. We would board the helicopters, go up to the area called Desert 2, which is where Meadows and Fred would be waiting for us. And then we would execute the plan as I mentioned earlier. The Air Force, when we were first given the mission, the Air Force, because of peacetime training limitations, had no one who could make night dirt strip blacked out landings, even in MC-130 aircraft. But they very quickly trained up, became very capable, and were prepared to do whatever we needed to do. They modified some EC-130 aircraft into fuel birds that would go into the desert, would refuel the helicopters, and then would leave and go back to the intermediate staging base. The weak link was always the helicopters. Number one, the RH-53 in those days was much lower powered than it is now. It had a pretty low aircraft load capability. It would take 6 of them, at least 6 of them, to be able to carry the assault force and the fuel necessary to get us to Desert 2, to come in the next day, land in the stadium, pick us up, and move down to Manzaria Airfield, where Dave Grange and Hard Rock Charlie would have secured the extraction airfield for us. When they launched from the USS Nimitz, there were initially 8 aircraft. The first one that went down was just after they coasted into Iran. That aircraft had a forced landing. For some reason, the overall helicopter commander and his aircraft landed, picked the crew up, all of which made sense so far, but instead of pressing on, they turned around and went back to the Nimitz, which is something that I still don't quite understand. Nevertheless, the remaining aircraft ran into a very bad dust storm and were unable to find Desert 1, where by that time we were waiting for them. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure which, the roadblock team, which Dave should have insisted was commanded by a Ranger, but it wasn't. It was commanded by an intel officer. They attacked a fuel tanker that was coming into the area of the landing zone, blew it up, fired a law underneath it that set the tanker on fire. And so there was this big column of flame in the middle of the desert that the helicopters eventually were able to get to. The first 2 came in about a half hour late. The second 2 came in about a half an hour after that. And then the last 2 showed up an hour and a half after the time they were supposed to have been there. And that right there was a big problem also, because we were running out of darkness. We would not be able to get to Desert 2 before daylight. I'll stop there and let Dave and Paul interject whatever they want to up to this point. And one thing that
That was very excellent.
one thing that I will mention, though, is that there were 3 very brave men who went into Tehran in a Twin Otter, not into Tehran, but into what became known as Desert 1 in a Twin Otter aircraft. They did a reconnaissance of the landing site. They emplaced remotely activated landing lights, and for that reason, when the Air Force went in with us, to meet up with the helicopters. That was how they managed to get in there.
Thank you. That's excellent.
I'd just like to add that, there was significant pressure put on everybody to maintain radio silence during the helicopter en route or the infill. And it wasn't that we were worried too much about the Iranians. We were more worried about the Russians who were in Afghanistan at the time, that if they intercepted some of our comms, that they could tip off the Iranians. But it was that they maintained radio silence, and they didn't. The helicopters definitely did not talk to each other during the infill. But as Bucky said, when Roger Berryhill, who was a comm guy on the lead helicopter, he called me and said, "Hey, Chief," he says, "I need some pyrotechnics to come into the landing zone." I told Roger, I said, "If you didn't see this tanker blow up and it looked like an atomic bomb going off," I said, "you're really lost." But I knew when that thing went off that they seen it in Chicago. It was really lit up the desert. But he was on the #1 helicopter, and I talked to him, and they finally made it in. But like I said, the comms was radio silence until they got there, and then we sorted things out.
Thanks. So General Grange, go ahead and take us through Rangers' actions during this time.
Sure. So I think maybe the best thing is to wait at the end for the extraction airfield. But I wanted to go back to a comment you made on coming up with tactics, techniques, and procedures, and the preparation of what Hard Rock Charlie went through with a piece of. Also, we had a battalion command post minus that was a direct link that had the communications would be with Colonel Beckwith and also with General Bott, who was the overall commander. One thing to keep in mind is that because of operational security, you remember an organization is manned and equipped according to TOE or MTOE, table of organization. And there's no fluff in there. In other words, that's the absolute minimum that a company, in this case, would have: number of weapons, personnel, vehicles, whatever. You lose 2 guys in the squad, you're already deficient in your capability. There's no extra. It's manned to exactly what the requirement is. So we had to task organize a little bit, and I had some troops that came into our company from other places in the battalion. One particular guy, and I like to name is Doc Donovan. And Paul and Bucky know Doc Donovan well. He was a medic, battalion medic, but he was key and pretty much attached to the Hard Rock Charlie the whole time. But also we didn't have the equipment necessary to secure the airfield. So when the communications went out in a classified manner, you will deliver nine military jeeps to Hunter Army Airfield, or buy 8 Suzuki motorcycles, or whatever the case may be. You got the stuff that came in. They didn't give you the best stuff they had. They gave you whatever they wanted to get rid of. And because you couldn't do maintenance openly on a base, you had to do everything internally. You had to be very innovative of how you got your troops. Who was a farmer? Who was a construction worker? Who knows how to drive a bulldozer? Who knows how to do this or that? And that's how we actually fixed and came up with ideas from within the company, right, to do those tasks. And special operations it does that. You do equipment off the shelf, buy stuff off the commercial off the shelf. You go ahead and modify things. That's how the Ranger Regiment got the 240 machine gun, because the M60s would always jam, right? After 100 round belt of ammo, you get a jam. So that's how we got the M40G. And I remember Downing saying, "That's great, Grange, great idea, but how are you going to fix it? Where are you going to get your PLL?" And I luckily came up with something that just said, "Well, the Marines have them. We'll just get it from the Marines." And he bought that. And we got the 240s. How do you think the body armor right now that's in existence started? A bunch of Ranger NCOs tested it out. At that time with steel plates, and then it went into ceramics and that. It just started the Ranger Regiment. And it did that because we were all pissed off, you might say, that we were still wearing Vietnam flak vests that all they do is stop shrapnel. Now, the point is, I'm saying, go back to your comment, special operations is known for that. It has to be fostered. And it's not generals dictating you'll have this or that. It's the sergeants and the young officers that really come up with that equipment you need for something like this mission. If an airplane breaks down on an airfield, how do you get it off the airfield? You don't have bulldozers. You don't have equipment. How do you move it off an airfield? Well, I can tell you right now, you can move a C-130 off an airfield that still has hot wheels. In other words, they're not flattened out yet. They're nice and round. With 10 Rangers. 10 Rangers can push a C-130 out of the way, off a runway, and continue the mission. And that's the kind of stuff we had to do. And how to hot wire a vehicle to move it out of the way if it's blocking the runway. So all the stuff, General Farrader, that we do today in the Rangers was developed not just from this mission, because other units did airfield seizures in the past, right? Most of them were parachute operations. And so this stuff was all developed during this mission with the current Ranger mentality and TTPs and how you take down an airfield, minus the parachute part. It was all air land. And so that preparation was just 24/7 for months and months and months, from Thanksgiving on to April, on rehearsing how to do that. Now, granted, the C-130s, and this is an important piece because Bucky talked about the helicopters, but the fixed wing had to be proficient in certain things. And though everybody advocated we can do a lot of stuff in the night, we weren't really that good at it yet. And so how to land blackout with C-130s on an incoming landing, not doing a pass. And because I remember throwing out chem lights in a bundle out of a parachute door on C-130s and doing a passover, and then come back and landing for real blacked out. That's really not blacked out. So using nods in the cockpits, all those things had to be done. And it was those flight leads, it was those young officers and NCOs that actually developed that and made that happen in support of Delta.
That's really excellent. And I'm thinking of names like Booma and Buford and Lamb, and Mellinger and Leon Guerrero and many others that were actually probably directly in Hard Rock Charlie. But these were the men that were spawned and took the regiment for the next 20 years as well. And I was going to mention the hot wiring as well, because the first time I saw that, I thought I may have seen this in Salinas, California, but I hadn't seen this in the Army yet. So
one other thing, if I may, sir, one other thing that's very important, I think, is the personal relationships between special operation units. It's a small community. And so the first time I met Bucky Burruss, for instance, as the company commander, actually I wasn't a company commander. I was asked to form a small unit with Doc Donovan and a few other people that had a little bit of extra training to support Delta on a mission down in Florida. And that's how I got to meet him and how I was in awe of this organization. And I remember him drawing on a hangar floor in chalk the outline of a building on a target, the different rooms, and how the guys would walk through in the rehearsal, because they had to do it inside a hangar because of OPSEC. And so, just some of those old techniques, just like chalk on a poncho liner, a poncho, when we used to have ponchos, or on a hangar floor, is a technique that actually works. And that's how we got together. And I think that may have been a little bit of how Hard Rock Charlie ended up working with Delta Force going forward.
Really neat, really neat. So as the raid continued, or the operation continued, describe where Charlie Rock was, and then Paul pitch in afterwards on what the architecture of the comma was just prior to the airfield accidents occurring.
So you want me to start with that?
If you would, sir, yeah.
Okay, so we did a lot of rehearsals all around the United States, desert airfields, obviously, all over. I think we must have hit every airfield there was, working on the techniques. And part of the problem, there was a lot of separate rehearsals. It was very difficult to do a full mission profile rehearsal with everybody in one spot. Very, very difficult because of all the different moving parts that Bucky brought up a little while ago. Very difficult to do. So that may have been a weakness somewhat in the plan. And And though we had some meetings together at Fort Bragg and different places, we did not really do the FMPs or full mission profiles as much as maybe we should have, because we knew there was some limitations on helicopters and some other stuff, amount of stuff. Think about going in and seizing an airfield where with a company where the largest weapons you had were Laws and M60 machine guns, not even 50 calibers. And you're doing blocking positions on an airfield that's going to land a number of 130s and helicopters coming in from Tehran, and assembling these people, accounting for these people, coming up with a CSAR plan in case the helicopter goes down, taking the helicopter that arrived and offloaded, loading it with some Rangers, and going back out, picking up the people that were shot down or crashed for mechanical reasons, whatever. With this size force, across the highway was a division, Iranian division post or camp, a division, an armored division. So, I mean, I guess the plan was, Bucky, TAC air, because we, organically, we didn't have the firepower. So this was when you put a motorcycle team on an entrance with a couple walls on their back to an airfield, or a gun jeep loaded down with 9 guys and 2 M60 machine guns, looked like the desert rats of North Africa, block an armored column. It was quite a task. So it was really kind of up to the air at that time to secure a ring of fire around Mansouriya Airfield if it ever happened. But that's what we rehearsed for. But I'll tell you, the biggest challenge is accountability, never leaving the man behind. How do you account for those disparate forces in this hostile environment, coming in, limping in on helicopters shot up, wounded guys, making sure people aren't lost or accountable? Nobody had GPS. Everything was map and compass. Everything was the old 77 radios, MX radios. A difficult task. So we put a lot of effort and accountability of our troops on all sides to get out of there and that was one of our tasks at the airfield.
Okay, great.
One thing that I should have mentioned earlier was air fire support. We had 3 AC-130 gunships that were going to support the operation, 2 over Tehran and 1 over Mansouriya. These were guys that we knew well because we had known them really before Operation Rice Bowl or Eagle Claw. Pappy Gallagher and his squadron of AC-130 gunships, we trusted the guys. We knew that if we called them, they'd be there. And that's what we were counting on for fire support at the embassy and at Mansouriya Airfield. Their first action in arriving in Tehran was going to be to get rid of the air defense radars, any aircraft that tried to move on Mehrabad Airport, and any other potential targets that could interfere with us. And then they would come in, one of them in direct support of us at the embassy. And one point there is that, going back to the restrictions placed on us, the president had said that we were not allowed to engage anyone external to the embassy wall unless we first used riot control agents on them. I thought it was kind of ludicrous because we're being sent thousands of miles downtown to hostile territory, and we don't have the discrimination to not kill civilians if we don't need to. I suppose that was what he had in mind. But nevertheless, I asked the chairman to please go back to the president and ask if he'd come off of this. He would not do so. And so, being innovative young soldiers that we were, I carried 1 CS baseball grenade as the riot control agent that we were going to use external to the embassy. I was going to throw it over the wall, call Pappy Gallagher, and tell him to put some 40 mish on that puff of smoke, will you? So, but at least we didn't disobey the commander-in-chief in that regard. But the AC-130s were key to the operation, and we knew we could count on them. Next man. Speak up, Paul. Dave.
Well, yeah, I'll just talk. I mean, we were in pretty good shape. I mean, we had the typical inter-team radios. We had the fortunate it was fortunate that the Army just bought us Motorola radios. I mean, we handed them out to the Rangers. We used them as our it was a commercial off the shelf digital private radio that we were able to use for our inner team. We had the typical PRC 25s, 77s, and Bucky carried a 66, so we have power support to the AC. So typically we were good inner team wise, and I felt very comfortable with the inner team. It was solving the problem of, communicating from the ISB into the target area. Colonel Beckwith talking back to General Watt. One thing we were fortunate of, General Vaught at the ISB, we had support from JCSC out of Tampa that supported the big links back to the Pentagon where General Vaught could talk to the president and all of that. So we didn't have to worry about that piece of the pie. But my worries were, how do we talk to the Nimitz? How do we talk to the MC-130, the Hyde site? And the critical part is when we had to call the helicopters in to come exfil us at the embassy, how are we going to do that? So we did that. We had communications in the MC-130 with a Whiskey 3 satellite radio with one hatch mount antenna in the world that was put on that bird. We had a Whiskey 3 satellite radio on the lead helicopter, and we found out that it would work with just a UHF blade. So we found out that put that Whiskey 3, we can talk on the UHF blade and hit the satellite. So that we did that. So it was innovative that we did it and tried it, and it worked. We had a guy on the Nimitz that could give us communications back when the helicopters lifted off, so we were good there. So we were really in good shape with the PSC-1 and the PT-25 on the ground, because I know that once we'll go into when it was aborted, but once it was aborted, Colonel Beckwith and Colonel Kyle, the air commander, they were definitely on both of those radios talking back to General Vaught. And I'll tell you a little story later on about how I got a hold of Dick Meadows and Freddie in there and how I told them to get out.
Okay, that's great, Paul. So take us through the Desert One airfield itself, Bucky, if you would, and we'll throw up a slide or two and just describe the next activities that occurred.
Indeed. Well, Desert One, as I mentioned, was to be the cross-load and refuel site for the H-53s and the C-130 aircraft. The plan had been that we would land, secure the airfield. Half an hour later, the helicopters would arrive. We would refuel the helicopters, board the helicopters, fly to Desert 2 up near Tehran, where Meadows and Aruji would be waiting for us. Sorry, Fred. But as I mentioned, because of the haboob, the dust storm, the helicopters were late in arriving, and we probably wouldn't have made it to Desert 2 that night to begin with. In fact, I remember asking a couple of our officers to make sure that we had a good alternate site at which we could RON that next night, and possibly even change it into a 3-day operation if we had to. But we needed to be out of sight and camouflage before daylight for obvious reasons. The fact that the aircraft showed up late was troublesome, but the real problem came when we were informed that only 5 of the helicopters were flyable. Now, this is eight aircraft had left the Nimitz. Only 6 arrived, and now we're down to 5. And the H-53 was not the most reliable aircraft in the world, particularly when you had to turn it off at night and restart it the next day. I'm not a helicopter guy nor a mechanic, but that was a problem we understood with it. If we had gotten 3 aircraft able to take off from the Hyde site at Desert 2, that would have been adequate to come into the stadium, pick up the hostages and the assault force, and evacuate the whole bunch because of the fuel that was burned off. Evacuate the whole bunch down to Dave Grange and turn everybody over to him, including ourselves. Actually, he was going to marshal all of us hostages, rescue force, and all. The fact that we only had 5 aircraft is what really caused the mission to abort. The fact that we only had 5 and might lose more than that. And I remember the op sched for this operation. One of the things said, if you have less than 6 helicopters to leave Desert One, and it was the only all caps word on that page was abort. So the decision had been made well ahead of time that we couldn't go on from Desert One with fewer than 6 helicopters. In spite of that, we had an exchange on the radio with the National Command Authority as to whether or not we could go ahead with 5. I remember Colonel Beckwith said, "Well, who do you want me to leave behind? Because we've got this thing, as Pete Schoonmaker called it, choreographed like a ballet. So everybody had a job to do. Everybody was needed, and if we couldn't get everybody into town, the possibility of successfully assaulting the embassy and rescuing the hostages was lessened by that fact. As it turned out, when the abort was ordered, some of the helicopters required more fuel in order to be able to fly back to the Nimitz, and so they were repositioning to get more fuel. Meanwhile, a couple of the C-130s had already taken off because they were low on fuel. For example, the first one in, by this time, was critically low on fuel and had to leave even before the helicopters were refueled. As the helicopters were repositioning to take on more fuel, one of them, for whatever reasons, lost control of the aircraft, crashed into one of the EC-130 fuel birds, and it was at that point at which we lost 8 brave airmen, 5 Air Force, 3 Marine Corps were in this conflagration. It was a huge fireball. In fact, my first thought was, dang, probably wasn't dang, but the Iranian Air Force has found us and putting in airstrikes. I mean, that was the initial thought that I had about it. The fire, there were thousands and thousands of pounds of fuel that were burning there. JP4, JP5, whatever it was at that stage, but the fire would burn for hours and hours. We were running out of fuel, and we knew we couldn't, and we're running out of darkness. So we knew we couldn't stick around and try to recover anybody from there without the whole mess being left on the ground there, with either Iranians and or Russians reacting against us. So we had to depart Desert One, regrettably, with those 8 brave airmen still in the flames of the burning C-130 and helicopter. It was pretty miraculous that B Squadron, which was aboard the aircraft that was hit, was able to get out of the aircraft. It was good discipline. They opened one of the crew doors and the flames came in, shut that down, opened the other one, and they very orderly withdrew from that aircraft, got off the aircraft and away from the fire. We had a couple of guys who went back into the flames to get a crew chief out of the flames, and we had a few slight burn casualties as a result of that. The remainder of the force was able to fly out, and there were thoughts of going again for another day, but the fact is that after the disaster at Desert One, it's improbable that we would have been able to return. It's certainly not in that same type of rescue operation.
Thank you, Bucky, for that. So let me just, as we get ready to wrap here, let me give you each an open mic, and Bucky, we'll give you 30 seconds to take a break, coming off of what was just a very sincere and emotional remembrance there. So if we use the words, courage and comrades and commitment, General Grange, what after the fact, for years to come, which of these words comes to mind? Courage, comrades, and commitment, and how did you see that play out for the rest of your career?
Yeah, actually, all three words. So keep in mind that though this was unsurmountable odds, right? For instance, I mean, I had a team under Sergeant Littlejohn that went with Delta in the Desert One to block the road under the command of one of Bucky's officers. The rest of us were going to seize Mansouriya Airfield and do the extraction. We never get out of Wadi Kenya, which is an ISB in Egypt, to do that. And when we heard the disappointing news, then just killed morale. No one cared about the odds. The courage was there, not because people weren't afraid. Everybody had fear, but we were trained so well, we didn't think we were going to lose. We were trained so well that we knew we were going to be successful. We were going to get everybody out, even if we road marched them. So the thing is, when you sit in a bunker there, old Russian airplane bunker, and you got the news you're not going to go, the worst sound in the world to a soft soldier is stripping ammunition out of a magazine, because ammunition is supposed to come out of the barrel of the weapon, not strip them out of a magazine. And so that just killed morale, and that was really tough. And I would say almost to a man, everybody just was there sobbing that the mission didn't go down. The thing about it, if you take something like the Ranger Creed, recognize that I volunteered as a Ranger, energetic way to fight the enemies of my country, never will live falling. All these things come to light. And so we carried that through the whole time. I did, and I know everybody else did, in other units that we served in, whether it be the Big Red 1, the 3rd Infantry Division, the battalion in Korea, the 503rd, whatever the case may be. Because it means something. It means something that makes the American soldier much more powerful and reliable and committed than other military in the world. I think that the one reason that I went after my tour as a longtime serving company commander, I was very, very privileged to do that, and went up to Delta is because of that relationship established during this mission. And there wasn't a selection process, and I don't know who it was, Colonel Beckworth or Burruss. They said, that doesn't matter, go to the SAS. They have one right now. Get over there. You got a week to get there. But that relationship was because of that camaraderie. So when you talked about earlier on the show about the discipline, basic discipline in soldiering, at the bottom of the pyramid as you go up to the most elite units, still is the most important thing there is, because in my experience, and I think the other people on this panel, when people get wounded or killed, a lot of it is not because of the sexy, magical, soft stuff that you learn later. It's very important. But what's more important is the baseline stuff of noise and light discipline, dispersion, tying down your equipment, following instructions, chain of command, those type of things is what gets people hurt and why things fail. Maintenance on a helicopter, whatever it may be. And so those things I carried with me the entire time I served. And it didn't matter that I was in a special operations command organization. They applied to general purpose forces, guerrilla forces, whatever as well.
That's excellent. Paul, would you also comment on, after this operation and then for the rest of your career and committed life post-service on, the courage and comradeship and the commitment that you derived from this?
Well, I never seen so much courage and commitment to talking about communicators. There wasn't one of them that, I used the whole signal squadron. We probably only had 15 guys at that time, but the courage and the commitment, there was nobody that said, all they do is send me, buddy, I'm ready to go. So it was their commitment to do this mission, and we were dedicated. We were a band of brothers. I mean, it was the Signal Squadron, the shooters. It was a whole band of brothers. Those 100 and some guys that were in the desert there, and the commitment to the Signal Squadron was, I have a Z rule here that says the shooter is always right, and you will support him 100%. So I always supported the shooter. I never said no to the shooters because I knew what they were up to and what they had to do. So the Signal Squadron, all of my guys were dedicated to support everybody. But over the years, my hats off are to all the communicators. 41 years ago. Look what they're doing today. I mean, they're streaming live video from the battlefield. They're watching the ships, the troops on the computer. They know where everybody's at. I mean, they have continued to research and develop the communications to today. I mean, and it's going to get better. I mean, you look at that diagram there. I threw that in there. That's today's network. We had maybe one line. We had one line to show Colonel Beckwith talking to us on the ground, but a very, very simple architecture, but you can see where the communicators have taken that in 41 years. It was their dedication, the research and the development, and the push to make things happen for the shooters. So Special Ops has, funded the communicators properly with MFP 11 funds that helps everybody, but especially in communications. When we wanted something, they SOCOM supported us in getting the right capabilities. So my hat's off to all the guys that supported us as far as funding. My hat's off to all the communicators that continue to make this thing happen in the world.
Fantastic. Bucky, would you give us your thoughts on these ideas of courage and comradeship and commitment?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate. I was very fortunate in my military career. I was always with the finest group of men, and later on women, that have ever been put together. I mean, I used to describe the Delta Force as the real essence of the Delta Force is the fact it was the finest collection of non-commissioned officers ever assembled on the face of the earth. And I stick to that, and that's true today. And I think that the others will agree. The courage among that group was such that if we had to do it over again and we knew how it was going to turn out, we were just told the C-130s fly as close as you can to Tehran. We'll take it from there. And Grange will be down to Manzaria when we get there. I mean, it was that sort of sense of let's get this done that was shared throughout the force. And all the supporting organizations, particularly the 1st Special Operations Wing and the Ranger Regiment, we couldn't have asked for any better support than we got from them. And it still humbles me when I wake up in the morning sometimes to think how it is that I was ever allowed to serve with and next to men and women of the caliber that I was allowed to do so. So I just want to say thanks, and thanks for having us on, General. You're muted, sir.
I'm sorry, thanks. No, yeah, I'll put $1 in the mute bucket here. But no surprise that you're humbled, and also no surprise that you were among them, because that's who you are. And we could have had Doc Donovan and several of the senior NCOs and somehow figured out a way to manage a panel on Zoom with that. But we acknowledge the significance of their impact over 30 years from this point and on forward. It's really awesome. For our audience, each of these men is probably in 3 or 4 different military Hall of Fames. And yet every time I've seen them or been around them or listened to them, they pass credit on to the younger soldiers who carried them on their shoulders to mission success. The words hard and dependable are just, burned into my brain on, you got to be the soldier's whatever, the soldier's chief, the soldier's commander, the soldier's general, and all three of you were that indeed. And with that, I'd like to ask Bill Butler to pull up the last slide, lest we never forget our fallen from this mission. And Bill, I'll let you take from here and close us out. Gentlemen, thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating. I'd just like to briefly read off the names of our fallen comrades. In memory of Major Richard L. Bake, U.S. Air Force, Sergeant John D. Harvey, United States Marine Corps, Corporal George N. Holmes, Jr., United States Marine Corps, Staff Sergeant Dewey L. Johnson, United States Marine Corps, Major Harold L. Lewis, Jr., United States Air Force, Tech Sergeant Joel C. Mayo, United States Air Force, Major Lindy McIntosh, United States Air Force, and Captain Charles T. McMillan II, United States Air Force. We are fortunate to have such brave men like them who are committed, and women committed to our country and fellow Americans. So just some final announcements for everybody. We've got our Depicting the Invisible exhibit. It's in the museum. We just opened it up a couple of weeks ago. It was created by the artist Susan J. Barron, and it talks about the tough topics of post-traumatic stress and suicide. She shares the personal struggles of 14 veterans through her work, and would encourage everybody to come see it. And we're getting ready shortly to launch a virtual exhibit of this physical exhibit here at the museum. On Saturday, May 1st at 10 o'clock, join us for another virtual rally point. We've got Richard Murphy, U.S. Air Force veteran and founder of Veterans to Farmers, and John Jackson, an Army Ranger and Army veteran and co-founder of Comfort Farm. Both will talk about their program to support veterans who want to get into the agricultural business. Memorial Day weekend here at the end of May is going to be action-packed. Friday, we've got the Wall That Heals, a 3/4 scale replica of the Vietnam Wall here at the museum. We'll also have a Gold Star Family Candlelight Vigil that evening. Saturday, we've got a motorcycle ride with A.D. Farrow, Harley Davidson, and Reichert Automotive Group. We also have a documentary screening and panel discussion with three D-Day paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division. They're going to share their experiences in Normandy, Northern France, and Germany with us. It'll be a great documentary and a great opportunity to learn from the greatest generation. And then Monday at 10 o'clock is our Memorial Day ceremony. Thanks, everybody, again for joining us, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you all. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Wars aren't fought by countries. They're fought by people. Now, hear their stories in their own words. Honor their service in your own way. At the only museum in America that gives a voice to all our veterans. The National Veterans Memorial and Museum. It's more than a museum. It's the new home of the brave.